On April 1st, 1918, April Fool's Day, as its detractors pointed out at the time, the Royal Air Force was established as the newest and youngest of Britain's armed services. As fighting still raged over the trenches of the Western Front, RAF biplanes helped to stem the tide of the last German offensive of the First World War, and also bombed blast furnaces and poison gas factories in Germany itself. When the war ended on the 11th of November, the Royal Air Force was the world's first, strongest, and largest independent air force, with over 22,600 aircraft and 300,000 personnel at its command. The service had triumphed in war, but could it survive in peacetime? Looking at a map of 1919, Britain's worldwide empire seemed even more powerful than before the First World War, with Turkish and German territories added to it. However, Britain was exhausted after 4 years of war. Millions had died or been injured, and thousands of soldiers, sailors, and airmen wanted to return home quickly. How could politicians like Government Minister Winston Churchill still keep control of the country and its vast empire, while also balancing the books? One answer was simple: make drastic cuts to the armed forces, including the RAF. Hugh Trenchard, Chief of the Air Staff, faced 3 challenges. 1, to reduce the size of the Air Force. 2, to ensure the survival of the RAF in peacetime at all, when both the Army and the Navy wanted to shut it down. 3, to win popular support for the idea of air power and show that it had a future. Churchill told Trenchard to make do with little, which he certainly did. The Women's RAF was disbanded altogether. RAF numbers fell from 300,000 to under 30,000. Thousands of planes were scrapped for spare parts, and landing fields sold at knockdown prices. However, Trenchard also showed that the RAF was still a valuable military force. In 1920, he sent 12 RAF planes to bomb rebellious hill forts and villages in the colony of British Somaliland. It took just 3 weeks for air power to end the war, defeating an enemy the army had fought for 20 years. The politicians back home were delighted. It was called the cheapest war in history. Churchill proclaimed that the RAF's first duty was to garrison the British Empire. During the 1920s and 1930s, it was used in the same way to defeat rebellions and control territory in Iraq, Palestine, Arabia, and the northwest frontier province of Britain's Indian Empire. Trenchard knew that he had to organise the RAF effectively to resist attempts by the Army and Navy to shut it down. A new training college for pilot officer cadets was set up at Cranwell. Ground crew and technical staff were trained separately at Halton Hall. This division echoed the British class system of the period. Mostly privately educated public schoolboys trained at Cranwell, which even had its own pack of foxhounds for hunting. Working class boys went to Halton Hall as apprentices. They were known as Trenchard's brats. On average, only 3 of them per year ever transferred to train as aircrew or officers at Cranwell. There was no attempt to recruit women at all, apart from as nurses. Trenchard understood that he needed to promote air power as the military force of the future, to win public support and keep the backing of politicians. RAF pilots set new aviation records. For example, in 1919, John Alcock and Arthur Brown made the first 16-hour non-stop flight across the Atlantic. Overcoming faulty equipment, fog and ice, they finished the journey by crash landing into an Irish bog they mistook for a field. Churchill presented them with the Daily Mail's £10,000 award, worth over £500,000 now, and they were knighted by the King. Other flyers pioneered new air routes across continents and carried mail to servicemen posted overseas. The RAF Central Band played on BBC Radio. Annual air pageants and shows held at RAF Hendon attracted politicians, celebrities and royalty. Volunteers were recruited to train as part-time pilots for the Auxiliary Air Force, while air squadrons were set up in universities. By the time he retired in 1930, Trenchard claimed, "I have laid the foundation for a castle. If nobody builds anything bigger than a cottage on them, it will at least be a very good cottage." However, in the early 1930s, the British government, in the face of the worldwide Great Depression, cut spending on the RAF again. Its aircraft were largely obsolete. In 1935, when King George V reviewed the RAF, all its planes were still biplanes, reflecting First World War technology. It was a force not fit for purpose. In 1932, British cinema audiences watched newsreels in horror as Japanese bombers unleashed death and destruction from the skies over the Chinese city of Shanghai. British politician Stanley Baldwin expressed the public reaction that Shanghai is a nightmare. He declared, "The bomber will always get through," and it was widely believed that in any future war, European cities would be obliterated by bombs and clouds of poison gas. It would be worse than the one fought between 1914 and 1918. As attempts at international disarmament stalled and Adolf Hitler rose to power in Germany in 1933, Baldwin became convinced that expanding the RAF would deter future attacks. However, he was profoundly shocked in May 1935, a month before he became Prime Minister, when he discovered that the Luftwaffe, the new German Air Force, already possessed around 370 more planes than the RAF. The Nazis had already broken the terms of the 1919 Treaty of Versailles by training pilots in secret and producing aircraft that could easily be converted to military use. In Britain, new training schools were opened, and the Women's Auxiliary Air Force was set up. The idea was that this would free up men to do jobs only they were allowed to do or thought capable of doing. The RAF Volunteer Reserve trained over 10,000 men to fly, deliberately recruiting them from a range of backgrounds to boost numbers, not just from the public schools. Single, fixed-wing bombers and fighter aircraft, such as the Hurricane and Spitfire, were developed and introduced. But it was only in 1938, after Hitler annexed Austria, that British aircraft production managed to turn out the number of expected planes. By 1939, increased spending meant that the RAF had 2,000 warplanes, but this was around half the strength of the Luftwaffe. Not only was the RAF short of aircraft, but many were also outdated in their design. When war was declared on the 3rd of September 1939, air raid sirens sounded over London, but the skies remained empty. The predicted mass bombings never materialised. During the phony war period, from 1939 to the spring of 1940, the RAF saw little action. When it did, it was disastrous. 22 Wellington bombers set out to raid Wilhelmshaven in Germany in December 1939 in close formation, in daylight, and without a fighter escort. 12, over half of the force, were shot down. This showed that bombers did not always get through after all. When Nazi Germany launched their blitzkrieg against France, Belgium, the Netherlands and Luxembourg in May 1940, the RAF suffered huge losses. In one period of 3 days, the number of slow-moving RAF day bombers fell from 135 to just 72 aircraft. By the time France fell, the RAF had lost 959 planes, 320 pilots dead or missing, and 115 taken prisoner. Next, the Germans launched the Battle of Britain in the summer of 1940 as a prelude to an invasion. Just 700 RAF fighters faced 3,500 Luftwaffe aircraft. RAF fighter pilots fought off Luftwaffe attacks on their airfields in southern England bravely. But had these continued, the service would have run out of men and machines in around a month. Churchill, Prime Minister from May 1940, paid tribute to the young pilots of the RAF, claiming that never in the field of human conflict has so much been owed by so many to so few. The few included experienced Polish pilots, exiled from their country by Nazi and Soviet occupation, but still eager to play their part in fighting Germany. On August 24, 1940, Sergeant Anthony Glowacki of No. 501 Squadron RAF shot down 5 enemy bombers in a single day. But in reality, the few, brave as they were, could never have kept their planes in the air without the support of the RAF ground crews who maintained them, or the backing of members of the Women's Royal Air Force. The latter did vital work. Women monitored incoming enemy aircraft by radar and kept communications open. For example, Flight Officer Elspeth Henderson at RAF Biggin Hill bravely remained at her communication post during the heavy Luftwaffe raids of September 1st, 1940, directly disobeying an order to evacuate the operations room she was working in. She carried on even after she was knocked to the ground when the room took a direct hit. Female pilots flew new planes straight from factories to airfields. These pilots were just as competent as men and would have fought too if they had been allowed to. With Britain's future hanging in the balance, Hitler ordered the Luftwaffe to switch from bombing RAF airfields to London instead. By October 1940, German losses were so high that the invasion plans were called off, and the bombing afterwards during the Blitz occurred only in the relative safety of the night. The RAF won the Battle of Britain, but only just. 1941 saw 2 decisive turning points, which changed what was mostly a European war into a truly global conflict. In June 1941, the Germans launched Operation Barbarossa, a surprise attack against their eastern neighbour, the Soviet Union. German aircraft switched from bombing Britain to support the new invasion instead. This took the pressure off RAF Fighter Command and British cities where over 43,000 civilians had been killed so far. In December 1941, Japan, Germany's Axis ally, launched a surprise attack on the US naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. The short-term impact on Britain was disastrous, as Japan occupied its weakly defended Far Eastern colonies. But in the long term, as a result of June and December 1941, 2 very powerful countries, the Soviet Union and the United States of America, joined Britain as allies, making it more likely that Britain would be on the winning side. Despite its continued involvement in fighting worldwide, the main focus of the RAF from 1942 became the bombing of Germany. Air Marshal Sir Arthur Harris controlled Bomber Command from February 1942. Through a strategy called area bombing, RAF planes aimed to devastate German targets in order, as Harris put it, to destroy the morale of the enemy civil population, and in particular of the industrial workers. Harris's command coincided with 2 important technical innovations. The Lancaster bomber was introduced into service, which could carry any size of bomb, including one as heavy as itself, while a new navigation device called G meant bombs could be dropped more accurately than ever before. Groups of bombers called Pathfinders, accompanied by Mosquito fighters, flew ahead of the main bomber force, dropping flares and incendiary bombs to better mark the target. British bombers operated by night and American ones by day. For the brave young men of the bomber crews, these were incredibly tense and terrifying night flights, where planes could be easily shot down over enemy territory. Bomber pilot Leslie Manser took part in a nighttime bombing raid over Cologne in May 1942. He successfully dropped his payload of bombs, but the plane was caught in searchlights and damaged by flak. Manser steered the aircraft away from the city, but lost altitude. and by this time the rear gunner was wounded, the front cabin full of smoke, and the port engine overheating. The plane flew over Belgium with an engine on fire and a wing burning. A crash was now inevitable. Refusing the offer of a parachute, Manser insisted on staying at the controls long enough for his crew to bail out. He was killed when the plane crashed and afterwards awarded a Victoria Cross. Around 44% of airmen were killed on these missions, and the average age of volunteers was 23. Those who survived crashes often became prisoners of war. Around a quarter of the crews were made up of airmen from countries of the British Commonwealth, such as Canada and Australia. The impact of Bomber Command's work could be devastating. In July and August 1943, 60% of homes in the city of Hamburg were destroyed, and over 42,000 people were killed by bombs and firestorms. In 1944, the British and Americans drove the Luftwaffe from the skies, and by 1945, Bomber Command was able to operate by day as well as night. A record 4,851 bombs were dropped on Dortmund in one night alone. War production was disrupted, and industrial cities were reduced to rubble. In February 1945, an RAF attack on Dresden, a beautiful city packed with refugees, but also a major railway centre for the German war effort, was destroyed by firebombs, killing around 35,000. Lothar Metzer, a boy at the time, struggled out of a cellar during the raid as the lights went out and filled with smoke. Driven from a second shelter by the bombing, he remembered streets full of fire and burning people. Critics at the time, and historians since then, have argued over whether aerial bombing was justified. It is debated whether it was actually effective. Many bombs missed their targets, and in some cases war production actually improved after bombing, as German civilians shared a determination to carry on, even though they realized their country was losing the war. It is also debated whether it was morally right to deliberately target civilians. What is true is that the 125,000 aircrew of Bomber Command were just as brave as the Battle of Britain pilots, and that they also risked their lives in the service of their country, seeking to defeat Nazi Germany. As the Second World War ended, the RAF was in good shape as a service. Despite the deaths of over 70,000 personnel, the majority from Bomber Command, it employed around 1,200,000 men and women, with over 9,000 aircraft. However, just like at the end of the First World War, and despite being on the winning side again, Britain was exhausted by nearly 6 years of conflict. The country was in debt, its towns and cities ruined by bombing, and the population had to put up with even stricter rationing than in wartime. The new Labour government promised to change the country, and in 1948 set up the National Health Service with free healthcare for all. But all this meant rapid cuts to defence spending, as soldiers, sailors, airmen, and women serving in the armed forces returned to civilian life. The wartime RAF was hastily dismantled, and many of its aircraft just scrapped. It lost 900,000 people, and fighter command was reduced to just 200 planes. The politicians assumed that there was little prospect of a major war breaking out again soon. This was quickly proved wrong. Tensions increased between the wartime allies, the United States and the Soviet Union, as the latter took over Eastern Europe. This tension developed into a Cold War, where both sides attracted allies to support them and built up their military capacity. Western countries founded the North Atlantic Treaty Organization in 1949, and Britain remained a key ally of the United States. In 1947, national service was introduced, where able-bodied young men were conscripted into the armed forces for 2 years, including into the RAF. At first, the United States had the advantage of possessing atomic bombs, which it had already dropped on Japanese cities in 1945. However, It was only a matter of time before the Soviets obtained a bomb of their own. In 1947, the British government decided to develop its own nuclear bombs to deter a Soviet attack. They would be entrusted to the RAF, which rapidly expanded again in the early 1950s. In 1950, it had 4,500 aircraft, which rose to 6,338 within 2 years. Second World War aircraft were replaced with jet fighters, some of which could carry air-to-air missiles. Bombers, capable of dropping a nuclear payload, took 8 years to develop. The most famous of these, the Vulcan, entered service in 1956. It was capable of flying behind the Iron Curtain at high altitude and of destroying Soviet cities. The Vulcan could carry blue steel, a nuclear missile that could be fired hundreds of miles from its target. But unlike the 1920s after the First World War, Britain was now less powerful as a country in its own right. It could no longer afford its worldwide empire and gradually gave independence to many colonies as they demanded it. In 1947, Britain's Indian Empire was partitioned into the new independent states of India and Pakistan. Despite this, the British government still saw the United Kingdom as a great power, willing to use force independently to retain its remaining territories and protect the country's interests around the world from different military bases. Sometimes Britain's role as a key ally of the United States in the struggle to contain the spread of communism coincided with its effort to keep certain valuable colonies. From 1948, the RAF saw action against Chinese communist insurgents in the jungles of the rubber-rich colony of Malaya. Even after Malaya became independent in 1957, the RAF continued to operate there, protecting the new democracy from the same insurgents. In 1956, the government of Egypt seized the Suez Canal from British and French control. The canal was a major trading route, and the British and French decided they wanted it back. Without telling the United States, their most powerful ally, the governments plotted secretly with Egypt's enemy, the State of Israel. Israel was encouraged to attack Egypt across the Sinai Peninsula, and then Britain and France invaded the Canal Zone. They claimed to come as peacemakers to separate Egyptian and Israeli forces. In fact, they had come to take back the canal. The Suez Campaign was a British military success. The RAF bombed Egyptian air bases, destroying 250 aircraft with no losses. But the Americans were furious and demanded the withdrawal of British and French forces. The Soviet Union threatened nuclear war. Internationally humiliated, Britain never again took such military action without the consent or support of the United States. The Suez Crisis strongly divided British public opinion. The end of Britain's role as an independent great power also gave the government the excuse it needed to slash expensive defence spending. In an age of nuclear weapons, conventional forces were thought to be almost irrelevant. The RAF was cut back again. The development of new aircraft was mostly scrapped. All military operations were now assessed for whether they were really necessary. British governments between 1956 and 1982 saw the nuclear commitment to NATO as their main priority. During the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, nuclear war very nearly broke out between the United States and the Soviet Union, who planned to place missiles in Cuba. Even British schoolchildren felt the tension mounting. A 13-year-old in a northern village reported, "Grown-ups huddled and gossiped in corners. We went to school and waited for the mushroom cloud to appear on the horizon." 40 aircraft of the RAF bomber V-Force were kept on high alert, ready to take off with their nuclear weapons at a few minutes' notice if the command to scramble came. Crews took to wearing their life jackets, and at one point were so sure the order to take off would come that they sat inside their aircraft with engines running. But despite nuclear standoffs, there remained irritating calls for the continued use of non-nuclear RAF planes and personnel around the world. The service was called up to take action in colonies where people within them took up arms to demand independence and an end to British rule, for example, in Kenya and Aden. In Cyprus, some Greek Cypriots campaigned violently for union with neighbouring Greece. The RAF helped to defeat an Indonesian invasion of Britain's former colony of Malaysia in the 1960s. RAF crews dropped humanitarian supplies to places affected by natural disasters, such as flooding in Kenya or a hurricane in British Honduras, now Belize. Yet governments continued to make cuts over the decades. The number of aircraft was slenderized, a government term, to just 2,004 in 1967 and fell to just over 500 by 1973. The Ministry of Defence, formed in 1964, usually preferred to buy foreign aircraft and equipment as it was cheaper than developing it in Britain. Bases were closed around the world. National service ended in 1968. Yet in 1982, unexpected news was splashed across British newspapers and media. The Argentine military dictatorship ordered the invasion of the British colony of the Falkland Islands at the tip of South America. Its small British population had no wish to become Argentinian, but they were poorly defended and easily occupied. The British government was taken completely by surprise. A key ally of the United States, with its own nuclear deterrent, had not been able to defend its own territory and felt embarrassed and humiliated. The Foreign Secretary resigned, yet many British people had never even heard of the Falklands. But did Britain's rundown military still have the capacity to fight a conventional war at a distance of 8,000 miles? Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher's government committed itself to recapture the Falkland Islands. A naval task force was sent from Plymouth, and this newspaper front cover summed up the mix of British feelings about this unexpected war. The headline deliberately echoes the second Star Wars film, The Empire Strikes Back, but also harks to Britain's past as a great imperial power. However, the cooperation of US intelligence was an important factor in the success of the campaign. 2 RAF Vulcan bombers designed to carry nuclear weapons bombed Port Stanley, the Falklands capital, dropping conventional payloads. Keeping RAF aircraft with enough fuel to operate at such a distance from Britain was a major technical achievement. Only 10 RAF Harrier fighters were lost during the campaign. Air Liaison Officer Bob Iverson was on a bombing raid when his aircraft was hit by Argentine fire. He says, "I saw the flame and pulled the eject handle instantly. Hiding in heather for an hour and a half from the Argentine helicopter searching for him, he took shelter in a deserted farmhouse. I didn't really sleep," Iverson said. "I was sitting up watching the war. You can see the shells in the air at night. When things quietened down, I broke radio silence and transmitted my position in code. By the time the helicopter came to pick me up, I was cooking myself a full English breakfast." The Argentines were defeated, but British strategy changed as a result. A new base was built on the Falklands to deter Argentinian aggression. Plans to scrap the Vulcan bombers were reversed. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev became leader of the Soviet Union. He attempted to reform communism from within and thaw relations with NATO countries. Agreements were made to cut back on nuclear weapons. Then communism itself began to collapse. Soviet-controlled countries in Eastern Europe became democracies in 1989. When the RAF took part in the Western campaign to expel Iraqi forces from Kuwait in the Gulf War in 1991, the Soviet Union even supported this effort as an ally. In 1991 too, the Soviet Union was itself dissolved. All this appeared to be a triumph for Western countries. It was as if they had won a world war without having to fire a shot. Instead of 2 superpowers threatening the destruction of the world with nuclear weapons, there was now only one, the United States. Part of the Soviet Union, the Russian Federation, was left as a weak democracy, but still armed with nuclear weapons. The rapid collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War took NATO completely by surprise. The assembled NATO air forces in Europe now faced no enemies. One historian claimed that it was the end of history and that democracy had triumphed. Politicians looked to make deep defence cuts as part of a peace dividend, just like they had in 1918, 1945, and after 1957. Through the 1990s, RAF bases in Germany were closed. Former communist countries in Eastern Europe gradually joined NATO, but the Air Force was still kept busy. Women were admitted as pilots for the first time to the RAF in 1990. It dropped humanitarian supplies in Iraq, Samoa, Somalia, and the Balkans. It also took part in action with NATO allies in 1999 against Serbia, and also in Iraq, protecting Kurdish rebels against the Iraqi government. All these involvements were on a relatively small scale. It seemed that although parts of the world were unstable, there was no serious challenge to the power of the United States and its allies. The world changed on the 11th of September 2001, when 4 airliners hijacked by Al-Qaeda, an Islamist terrorist group, attacked New York's World Trade Center and the Pentagon in Washington. 2,996 people died. It was the worst act of terrorism on American soil, and the first time the mainland United States had experienced warfare since 1867. Americans were united in shock, grief, and anger. For the only time in history so far, the United States invoked Article 5 of the NATO Treaty, obliging all its allies to come to its aid. In response to the attack, President George W. Bush launched the War on Terror, designed to root out Al-Qaeda terrorists around the world. The Taliban government of Afghanistan had sheltered Al-Qaeda and its leader, Osama bin Laden. It was America's first target. As a loyal ally, Britain had a common interest in defeating anti-Western terrorists and took part in the Afghanistan campaign. A democratic, pro-Western government was set up in Kabul, the Afghan capital, but American and British forces were drawn into the conflict to protect it against ousted Taliban fighters. RAF crews supported British forces on the ground by providing air support, reconnaissance, and by delivering supplies. Pilots were instructed to remain on the ground in remote areas for no more than 30 seconds because of the risk of attack. America's second target in the War on Terror was Iraq. President Bush accused its dictator, Saddam Hussein, of having links with Al-Qaeda and of secretly developing weapons of mass destruction. Despite opposition from NATO allies in Europe, the British government sided with the Americans, and the RAF took part in the 2003 invasion, which quickly overthrew the Iraqi government. Like the Suez Crisis in 1956, British involvement strongly divided public opinion. The British government was also embarrassed by the failure to actually find any weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. The RAF supported the British military occupation of the city of Basra in southern Iraq. But like American soldiers elsewhere in the country, British forces came under attack from Iraqi rebels. In 2005, 9 airmen and a soldier were killed when an RAF Hercules aircraft was shot down. The British withdrew from Basra in 2007, the same year that homegrown Islamist terrorists struck London, killing 52 people. All RAF operations in Iraq stopped in 2009. This was the same year that US President Barack Obama took power. Americans were now weary of the war on terror, and the new president looked to scale back involvement in the conflicts started by President Bush. The US withdrew combat forces from Iraq in 2011. But international events made it difficult to avoid the intervention of Western countries abroad. A civil war in Libya in 2011 saw the RAF deployed to evacuate British civilians and attack targets of the oppressive Libyan government, helping to assure a rebel victory. Meanwhile, the American withdrawal from Iraq and a civil war in Syria led to an extreme Islamist organization, ISIS, seizing power across parts of Iraq and Syria. Its regime was brutal. Torture, kidnapping, mass executions, and slavery were used to control the territories ISIS conquered. It exported terror abroad. In June 2015, 30 British holidaymakers were murdered by an ISIS gunman on the beaches of Tunisia. Paris was attacked in November. The RAF was deployed to strike ISIS targets alongside American Canadian pilots. All ISIS territory was freed from their rule by 2019. Western countries faced new challenges after the war on terror ended. The Russian President, Vladimir Putin, seeking to restore the glory days of the Soviet Union, seized the territory of Crimea in 2014 from its neighbour Ukraine. Sanctions were imposed on Russia that did nothing to deter Putin. Communist China was expanding its influence and its armed forces. It chose to ally with Russia. In 2019, US President Donald Trump began negotiations with Taliban rebels in Afghanistan about withdrawing American forces from there. In 2021, US President Joe Biden actually did withdraw them from the country. The pro-Western Afghan government swiftly collapsed, and the Taliban returned to power. Both the Americans and their British allies were embarrassed and humiliated by the forced withdrawal and evacuation from Kabul airport. Although the RAF successfully evacuated around 15,000 individuals, hundreds of people were left behind. Britain had been involved in the Afghan war for 20 years at a cost of £30 billion, only to see its enemies triumph. A secret and expensive scheme was launched to evacuate Afghans who had worked with British forces and their families, and whose name had been accidentally leaked by email. In March 2022, Russia launched a full-scale invasion of its neighbour Ukraine. NATO countries, including Britain, supplied weapons, ammunition, and military equipment to the Ukrainians so that they could resist Russian aggression. 200 Ukrainian pilots were trained in Britain by the RAF on Grob Tutor aircraft like this. One said, "The course has been challenging and enjoyable. It has made me a better pilot. I am grateful to the UK for its support to Ukraine." In November 2024, Donald Trump was re-elected US President. He sought to bring an end to the Ukraine war by negotiating with Russia. The president cast doubt on whether America would come to the aid of NATO allies if they were attacked. This meant for the first time in 80 years that European countries, including Britain, could not assume that they were protected by American nuclear weapons. Trump demanded that NATO allies increase the amount they spent on defence, and the British government responded by cutting foreign aid and raising defence spending. As at other points in the over 100-year history of the RAF, threats to Britain from abroad may see the service expand, as it did during the First World War, the Second World War, and during the early 1950s. What is certain is that whatever the future brings, the men and women of the Royal Air Force stand ready to serve their country bravely, just like their forebears.